Hello, everyone, and on behalf of the museum, welcome. Thank you for your support and joining us today for our Unzipped dialogue, Flappers to Rappers, A Century of Fashion, Music, and Teenage Culture from 1920 to 2020. My name is Rachel, and I'm the Adult Programming Manager here at the museum.
Oh, I can't hear anything. Ken?
So sorry about that, everyone. Just a couple little technical glitches there as that happens. We really appreciate your patience, so thank you. So yes, welcome to our event, Flappers to Rappers. We are very excited to welcome Jonathan Walford from the Cambridge's Fashion History Museum. Before we begin the event today, I would just like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. In particular, we'd like to acknowledge the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. So thank you, Jonathan, for joining us. And just as a small intro, Jonathan is one of the founding members of Cambridge's Fashion History Museum. He's worked in the museum field since 1977, authored 6 books on various histories of fashion, and curated over 50 exhibitions on various fashion themes. You can write your comments or questions for Jonathan in the YouTube live stream comment box. The chat will be monitored, so please remain respectful to our speakers and guests. Thank you so much, everyone, and please enjoy the dialogue. Jonathan, I pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you. This talk is based on a couple of things. First of all, it came about because the museum has an exhibition right now called Unzipped about the Rolling Stones. And it's sort of done in the same vein as the David Bowie exhibition that was done at the AGO a few years ago, but pre-pandemic days. So we wanted to do something that kind of tied into that. And so we thought it'd be interesting to do an exhibition as we were reopening around the same time that sort of put into context how music and fashion relate to each other, especially in teenage culture. And when I say teenage, it's kind of not quite correct. I mean youth culture. But they're sort of difficult to try and determine what that particular sort of period of life is. The United Nations actually identifies youth as the ages of 15 to 24. And that sounds about right to me. If you sort of think back in your own life between the ages of 15 and 24, that's when pop culture really matters to you. And you know all the names of the bands and you know exactly who's doing what and you know what all the trends are in fashion. And these are things you follow and actually mean something to you. And I think once you sort of get beyond 24, at that point, we're worried about, career and love and that kind of thing, a little less about what's happening out there. What's more important is how tight your jeans are kind of thing. So I think that's an interesting period to look at. And before that happened, before we got to that stage, we were looking at a division between essentially childhood and adulthood. So you were raised as a child, and then suddenly you became an adult. So it's like in the Jewish tradition of when you turn 13, you become a man or a woman. So there's not much room in between that. And the clothing was like that as well. If you look at a lot of clothing of what children were wearing, they were like little adults. They essentially had the exact same garments on that their parents had, just scaled down and maybe short. If you were a girl, for example, you'd have a shorter dress on. Your hair would be down as well. And then suddenly, sort of somewhere around the age of 14, 15, 16, your hair would go up, your skirt would go down, and then suddenly you're one. So that's kind of a big jump. And this sort of youth culture is a great way of sort of transitioning yourself into the next generation. So this is what's happening before the First World War. This is a girls' outfits from about 1909, and the sort of songs that are around tend to be sentimental, often Irish tunes, love ballads, that kind of thing. I did find this one sort of interesting song title called That Ragtime Suffragette. So there's things that are happening that are beginning to change. And that a lot of that in the music world is due to Thomas Edison's phonograph. Suddenly you have a commercial way of writing a song and getting it out there for many people to hear. You don't have to go to a music hall or vaudeville or something to actually hear a song. You can actually buy it and play it over and over and over again. So this is really the beginning of when things really begin to change. 1913 is when the Billboard magazine starts printing its top 10 lists as well. So this is sort of a period when things are really beginning to happen. Now, the big thing that happens first is the First World War. And this changes how everyone deals with the world around them. And just to sort of put into context, the World War I interrupted life and the years that immediately followed it as well, right after armistice. There was political polarization, there was an inflationary economy, a social and racial upheaval, and the global pandemic. So it sounds like kind of familiar. So we're kind of going through a lot of the same stuff right now that they were going through during the First World War and immediately afterwards as well. The big difference here is that a huge number of youth that served in the First World War and then also suffered from the Spanish influenza were killed off because of those two things. The vast majority of, for instance, American soldiers in the First World War didn't die from combat. They died from Spanish influenza. So you lost a generation. You had this young generation who went into the war, and not a war that they started, something was started by their parents and grandparents' age kind of thing, and lost their life. And there was this huge loss of life. At the end of it, you suddenly have not enough men for women to marry. So more women are looking at careers. They move into urban centers. They start working in business, that kind of thing. So there's a whole shift in how the world works. And to the tune of that is ragtime. And ragtime is this new type of music. It has its roots at the end of the 19th century in Black culture, primarily in the South and Midwest of the United States. And it gradually infiltrates into white culture via the one song that really sort of at the beginning and end of it is Alexander's Ragtime Band. That was written in 1911. It's hugely popular. It was played on the Titanic even, was one of the songs that was on their repertoire. So it was this really popular tune that broke ragtime and syncopated rhythms for white people to listen to. And that means it sort of spreads very quickly throughout all of society, becomes hugely popular, and there's suddenly a way of now making tons of money by playing, writing these and playing these jazzy type of tunes that are based on ragtime. So at the end of the First World War, you now have a different world. And from that emerges a younger generation that just doesn't want to do things the way their parents did it. They've lost their friends, their relatives, their brothers, their sisters, that kind of thing, and to hell with it. So they're going to live a different life, and they have a very different attitude. And the flapper is born. This is a term that actually has its origins back at the turn of the century. And a flapper was the age of that girl that she's a little too old to be a girl, a little too young to be a woman. So this is perfect for youth culture. This is exactly what the flapper is. It's that teenager, early 20s type of person. And they're very interested in their sexuality. They're very interested in doing things in a modern way. They don't want to wear petticoats and dance the waltz. They want to wear very little clothing, and what it is they wear, they have to be very comfortable. They're interested in jazz, they're interested in heavy petting and open cars and smoking and all that kind of stuff. And part of that too is this sort of the smart, sassy language that comes up. So in 1921, all these idioms show up that are documented for the first time, like he was taken to the cleaners and for crying out loud, and I'm going off the deep end, all that kind of stuff. I don't say the Brooklyn accent, but anyway, the whole idea is that this kind of the smart talk kind of becomes part of this whole kind of thing as well. Words like slinky and patootie and goofy, and they begin to sound like some Bobster's mole. This is where this sort of language kind of comes in. There was this brief publication called The Flapper. I think it was only around for about 2 years. And as the covers say, it's not for old fogies. So it's all about flapper life, and it's how to dress like a flapper, how to act like a flapper. Actually, this is from Flapper magazine from 1922. It says the typical flapper is coquettish, independent, daring, and pert. She dances with abandon and can be identified by her bobbed hair, powder and rouge on the face, use of lipstick, plucked eyebrows, absence of corset, little underclothing, and roll your own stockings. And this is happening at the same time that Ladies' Home Journal, that very respectable publication, is saying unspeakable jazz must go. We reprove those dances which are lascivious. Rapid and jerky music is condemned, with any form of improper dancing is disapproved as a degrading tendency. So they're not really in favor of it. So there's the flapper, and with the flapper you get things. With that culture, you get, for instance, this is considered sexy. The first picture are contestants for a beauty contest. This is when beauty contests start, is in 1921, 22. I think that was 22. And here by the end of the 1920s, we have Joan Crawford from Dancing Daughters wearing a dress that's very revealing and very tight, and not your sort of typical 20s type dress, but obviously sexuality is a very important part of that particular type of look. Along with that comes, as I mentioned before, smoking. This is something that a lot of women are doing, partly to stave off hunger pangs, because dieting is very popular in the 20s. You don't have figure conforming corsets anymore, so you now just have to stay thin through diet and exercise. So smoking helps. And you're also cutting your hair. This is considered very modern. The origins of it go back to the First World War, of keeping your hair out of machinery and things like that. But it's just considered very contemporary. You no longer have to, fuss with doing your hair up and that kind of thing. It's very modern. It's very boyish, and it's considered very liberated. So along with that, however, also comes, the things that your mother warns you about, fast men in raccoon coats and doing stupid things like dancing on the edge of the tall building. So there's this kind of reckless behavior too that goes with the whole kind of flapper notion, is this very sort of carefree gal and her boyfriend, collegiate boyfriend, who's probably up to no good. So there's the 20s. And then with the dancing, the jerky, jazzy dancing that's going on, that eventually kind of smooths out and turns into swing. And swing is softer at first and easier to dance to. It's more about a little more romantic. The 30s kind of looked back at the 20s as being a bit silly. They almost immediately kind of looked back and thought, well, that was kind of dumb. And partly because they got into such huge financial trouble because of the speculation in the stock market, that kind of thing, which led to the demise of the economy in the 30s. So they weren't exactly keen on carrying on that whole kind of 20s world. They're looking for a new way of expressing themselves. So with the 30s, there comes a longer garment, even for young teenage girls. I thought was interesting here is that the three women on the left it's Shanghai, and because they're in Shanghai, there's a Chinese tradition of women wearing pants. So it's not particularly shocking for three girls to be walking down the street wearing pants in 1932. That'd be harder to do in New York or Paris at the same time. But because they're Chinese and because it's part of the tradition of wearing pants, it's not particularly shocking in Shanghai. On the right is dance marathons, which they actually started in the 1920s, but in the 30s, they became a way of making money. There'd be a prize of the longer you lasted on the dance floor, which could go on for 2 or 3 days. There's a great film about that, 1972, I think it was made, called They Shoot Horses, Don't They? So it's all about those dance marathons. So here we have some of the dancing that's going on in the 1930s. Line dancing, for example, becomes very popular. You get the beginnings of Latin music in the 30s as well. You get rumbas and not cha-chas, rumbas, there's another one, sambas as well, but they're probably doing like a samba or something like that with that particular dance. But along with the sort of the newer way of looking at the sort of the softer music and the easier dancing, comes also a realization that the teenager is a group to market to. So it begins in the early 1930s in a department store in St. Louis, Missouri. Irving Sorger is his name, and he realizes that the girls who are shopping with their mothers don't want to dress like their mothers. They want to wear something which is very designed for them. And when also you're younger, you tend to be slimmer and you haven't quite completely filled out yet. So it's not just, the shape is a little bit different, but also then the styling is a bit different as well. So he hires women out of the fashion program out of the local university to design clothes for the department store. And very soon what is created is the juniors market. And St. Louis became, right through into the 1970s, the center of the juniors market in the United States. So there are all these young women coming out of university, going directly into working for these. And they would take styles that were established elsewhere, Paris, New York, that kind of thing, but they would focus on making them youthful. And that's really what you wanted to go for, was this sort of more youthful kind of approach to fashion. Next one. There we go. And here's some examples here. So the article on the left is changeabouts for teens and 20s. So this is high fashion, but it's designed for the youth market. This is what they're aiming at. And for men, the exact same thing too. This is a market that these wide-legged pants and these rayon shirts and wide ties, they're aimed with, you know, they show the patterning that they got. They're aimed for a younger generation, for a younger man who wants to go out dancing and that kind of thing. So it's all designed very much for a younger generation. And then towards the end of the 30s, you begin to get into a much wilder type of swing music, and the dancing gets quite energetic. In fact, you can see here that the women are dancing with low-heeled shoes. It's not as easy to dance with high heels either. This becomes an extremely sort of aerobic type of exercise, and becomes particularly popular right through the 1940s, and eventually turns into what we know sort of as jive music. It's essentially jitterbug is another name for it. Then there's different names for it. But it's based on the Charleston that was kind of happening in the 1920s, but it sort of gradually just morphs into this very energetic type of version of dance instead. One of the things that's interesting too is that this is very much an American form of dance. It doesn't really it doesn't originate from anywhere but the United States. And a lot of films that take place that are done nowadays, and they're actually trying to show what it was like to live in England, for example, during the war, and they'll have the dancers doing lifts and moves and turns, stuff that weren't being done before the war, but they didn't actually have access to that information during the war. So very often what was being danced in Europe was much tamer than what was being danced in the United States, because the dance got quite crazy, 1940, 41, 42, that kind of thing. So then by the end of the war, 45, 46, then they catch up on what the latest dance steps are. But it all pretty much all comes out of the United States. This is also, as I mentioned before, this is kind of an era where they're now catering to the teenage culture. They know it exists. It's something that they want. There's an audience there for it, and the audience has money. So there's this kind of classic kind of teenage look that's popularized by Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney in the film that they were doing, and this kind of collegiate kind of thing with the straight skirts, the tweed skirts, the saddle shoes, the penny loafers, the sloppy Joe sweaters. There's some other examples here. These are all wartime fads. These sloppy Joe sweaters in the upper left hand. Basically, it's like a boyfriend sweater. So it's an oversized sweater over a tartan or pleated skirt. And wearing also shirts outside, untucked shirts, both for boys and girls, very popular during the war. There's this peculiar fad at the end of the war of sharing shoes with your best girlfriends. You like for the same size, I guess that works, but otherwise it'd be very difficult. And then also there's this kind of graffiti type thing, which you see a lot of sweatshirts at the time in the 40s, from the late 30s until the late 40s is when that's most popular. And you get a lot of saying, like when I think you can see Kilroy was on the top, on her right shoulder. It's just sort of cutesy sayings, cartoons, that sort of stuff. Usually they're kind of sassy and fun. So that's just part of that whole kind of teenage look that they're doing. The big look that happens that has the most impact internationally is the zoot suit. And here's a bunch of white kids doing a very sort of tame version of the zoot suit. First of all, these are really hard to find. They just don't seem to have survived history. And I know there's a very famous one that sold for gazillions of money at an auction in New York about 5 or 10 years ago, and is now in the LA County or Fashion FIDM, Fashion Institute of Design Merchandising. It's in their collection. And it's quite something that looks like something Cab Calloway would wear. It's like very over the top. These little more subtle type ones, they're really hard to find. I don't know if anybody actually knows where there's a real one. I've never actually held a real one. I've held a real jacket, but not a suit. And sometimes they weren't necessarily worn as a suit. They were sometimes worn as jackets with trousers. But I mean, it's really hard to find these things. So if you find one, or if you have one, you know how valuable it is and how it belongs in a museum somewhere. I have an idea for where it could go. Anyway, the whole idea with the zoot suit is this oversized jacket and these very full trousers. And then also, again, the jackets are worn by the girls as well, the girlfriends. It becomes kind of a boyfriend jacket kind of look. In its origins, the two biggest proponents of the style are the Hep Cats from Detroit and New York, particularly the Black culture, and then also Hispanic culture in California with the Pachucos. And these two groups are probably where the style the most extreme, but there's differences. So, for example, amongst Black culture in Northeastern United States and in the central part, hat is a terribly important part of the look. Where it's not with the Pachucos, because the Pachucos wear their hair differently with the ducktail at the back. So the hat isn't as important. And you can see here we have 5 young Pachucos without any hats on them. And meanwhile, there's these two Hep Cats in Detroit wearing their hats very proudly on the back of their head. So it's all part of the look. So there's these sort of regional styles within. Now the style spreads to around the world, and what we have here are 3 German men wearing what they can do as a zoot suit. What they normally would do, and this begins fairly mid-late 30s, sort of 30, 37, 38, maybe the zoot style begins. At that point, Germany is already well ensconced under Nazi doctrine. So it's really hard to show anything apart from being dressed very appropriately for what the Nazi doctrine is. So you can't even buy a zoot suit in Germany. It's not available. So what you have to do is you have to buy a larger suit and then have it tailored to fit you. So you have the waist taken in, that kind of thing. But meanwhile, the jacket is actually much too large for you. So that's about as zoot suit you can get in Germany. But that is the look that they're going for. And they mix it with a little bit of English style as well. They love carrying umbrellas like the English do and that sort of thing. So, and it's being done as a political statement. They are opposed to the Nazi party. That they're trying to show that they're not in favor of it. There's a film about it called Swing Kids. The dancing not very good in it. It's too much. But anyway, the storyline is overly dramatic, but essentially true, more or less what was going on at that particular time. So the dance, and this is a youth thing. I mean, it's just only young people will be stupid enough to think that they'll survive by showing outright rebellion in the face of something like an authoritarian government. So anyway, this is something that was going on in Germany. In France, the same thing too was happening. And there was actually in both Germany and France, there was the girl and a boy look. And the girls wore these very tall platform shoes, very short skirts. This is a caricature of one. And they're called zazu. And the zazu, I think it's probably named after a song where the refrain is zazu, zazu in it. But anyway, the costume for the boys is very much like what you're seeing in Germany, although they have better access to fashion. So they have a lot of, for instance, very colorful socks are very big with the French look as opposed to the German look. But for the girls, it's very similar: white framed sunglasses, big updo hairstyles, shoulder purses, that kind of thing. So you can identify exactly who you are on the street. They get very dangerous at one point because even where Star of David's with Zazu written on it in protest of the Jewish Star of David to notify the Jewish people. So dangerous way to live at the time, and if you carried it on, you end up in a work camp, generally speaking, or worse. After the war in England, there was essentially their version of the zoot suit. But they picked up on the style after the war. Actually, I forgot to mention during the war was the zoot suit riots. That's what I was supposed to talk about. Let me just go back a little bit. There you go. Okay, so here we are. The zoot suit riots, where this is something that happened in 2 places. It happened in Los Angeles in 1943, and it also happened in Montreal in 1944. And because what they are wearing is essentially illegal, there's too much fabric in it, according to wartime amount of fabric permitted per garment. So once you still have these in your wardrobe, if you continue to wear them, you're essentially doing something illegal. And it becomes representative of like a draft dodger or someone who isn't in support of the war. It's seen as being unpatriotic. And in Los Angeles, it's generally race-based, but it ends up being, I think, a 3-day, basically a riot in Los Angeles. In Montreal, I think it's about a day. But one in Montreal was in 1944. It was quite late, so it was quite late in the war. And a lot of times, kids who were walking down the street were being beaten up by military men for being zoot suiters, and they were just wearing their dad's suit because the dad was off to war or something like that. They were just trying to use whatever fabric and whatever garments were available. So it wasn't. It was more of an anti-French conscription thing, so you didn't have to go to war if you were in Quebec. So that's why it became a big thing there. So anyway, so that's the Zoot riots. Okay, so after the war in England, we have the Teddy Boys, and the Teddy Boys, it's after Edwardian. That's where the Ted comes from. So they're picking up on these sort of full jacketed looks, full trousers, based on an Edwardian style. And their girlfriends, the Teddy girls, are also picking up this kind of sort of quasi-Edwardian style with a bit of sort of modernism for them. He's wearing these wonderful string sandals with coats and wool dresses, very English. So I think it's sort of a wonderful sort of combination of styles and periods into one particular look. This particular look at this point, it's not so much the swing music that they're going for. This is early rock and roll they're now picking up on. And this is really the Teddy Boys eventually sort of morphs into a form of like Stray Cats, that kind of rockabilly kind of sound. That's kind of the look that's kind of the music that they're following. Eventually, because the Teddy Boys don't go away, they survive as a sub group right into the 1980s. You can see them; they're still around today. But anyway, they do kind of survive for on and on for quite some time. The Teddy Boys were also, I mean, part of them also branched off into what we would call in the United States greasers, and over there they would call rockers. And that's the leather jacket, motorcycle driving, bad boys. It's all denim and leather and that kind of thing. So that's also the other look that Teddy Boys often morph into as another group to follow. When you get to the 50s, it's this kind of division between, good and bad. So you have this sort of, good girls and bad girls and good boys and bad boys. So there's a sort of this, there's this lovely white jacketed and prom good girls and good boys. And then you have the bad boys who often follow after people like Elvis Presley, who's gyrating his hips on television and doing naughty things. Rock and roll itself is, it's just it's disguised, it's upbeat tunes and there's tons of innuendo and slang and sexually charged lyrics, and rock and roll itself means basically to have sex. So it's this sort of interesting combination of trying to in some cases sort of make it look pure, and other cases just kind of going with it and being kind of bad boys. I mean, here's Elvis is even dressed like an ex-con, so I mean he's a bad boy. We have a girl here dancing with Alvin the Chipmunk on the other side. So it's this kind of interesting way of trying to make it work. And of course, there's the Eddie Fisher and Pat Boone and that kind of side of rock and roll. And then there's the Elvis Presley and the Jerry Lee Lewis side of it as well. So for women, the fashions for teenagers tend to go one of two routes. There's either the dressier route with the tight sweater and the tight straight skirt, and for a more casual look, there's the rolled up jeans with the cardigans and blouses. So these are essentially the two looks that kind of make up most of a 1950s teenage girl's wardrobe, apart from dressing up. In England, here's the rockers on the left, and the opposite of the rockers are the mods. And the mods are sort of the clean cut guys. They look clean cut, they're just bad, but they dress well. So they think they get away with more. And the Beatles, when they first started, when they were still performing in Hamburg and in Germany before they came to England, sort of made their way to fame, they often dressed as greasers. So when they got hold of and they were sort of cleaned up for the general public, they were made into mods. So this was considered more television ready. This is considered safer look for young gentlemen to pick for fame, whereas a greaser would get you kicked out of a bar pretty quickly. A mod would be accepted, and you can get ahead further. So That's where that comes from. And that's also the look that picked up in Motown as well. This whole black movement from soul and music picks up on being dressy. And this is all very chic, men in ties and jackets, women's in cocktail dresses and done hair. So it's all picking a very clean approach for the best acceptance. You don't want to appear like you are a rebellious teen, right? That's the whole point. So you're trying to look respectable for acceptance. Back to the bad girls. So there's the twist, which actually is either side of the fence. But the good thing about it is it's very easy to do, and it actually finds a lot of acceptance with all age ranges. So everyone loves doing the twist, doesn't matter how old you are, and it's easy to do and it's fun to do. But here we have bad girl with big hair, and big hair has always been, well, if you've watched Hairspray, you know it's a bad thing. So that's part of the look of being a bad girl too. Mod is the respectable thing, not just for boys, but also for girls. So here we have Mary Quant. She's probably the grandmother of mod in England. She started in 1959, I think it was. And she started a boutique where what she wanted to do was create clothes that were suitable for younger women. And what she often did is she would take American patterns and then she would zip things up on a sewing machine and then sell them in the store the next day. And that turned out to be a very successful way of doing business. And she gradually would get more and more women coming into her store. She would change the fabrics, of course. She would sort of, make it appropriate for a younger generation. So she picked big floral prints and, make the hems a little shorter. She didn't do the whole mini skirt thing. We'll get to that in a second. But she would create these dresses that were suitable for young, respectable women to wear. And that created this whole kind of mod look. The miniskirt myth, everyone says that she created the miniskirt. She didn't, and she even admitted it herself, but she's forgot that she admitted it, but it's in black and white. She would make dresses that were suitable for a young girl, a young woman, to have the hem just basically at the knee. So you like you see the dresses here in the middle, that kind of thing. But the girls who bought the dresses would then take them home and then flip them up 3 or 4 inches or 5 or 6 inches. So it was really her clientele that were making the mini dress that were so popular. They were using her clothes, but it wasn't actually Mary Quant's design. Then in the mid-60s, the teenager of them all, Twiggy, comes on the scene as sort of the ultimate in high fashion. And she's, I think, 16 when she makes it big in 1966. But she meteors to the top. So really all fashion becomes then very much geared towards the baby boom generation at this point. And up until this point, you were talking about a smaller generation, but the baby boom generation is huge, and they're going to dominate now for the next 20, 30 years. One of the fads at the time was to iron your hair. If you had hair that wasn't cooperative or curly or something like that, you wanted that dead straight look. That actually came out of the beat generation as well. And I will apologize, I meant to say this at the very beginning. I know people are going to say, well, he didn't talk about that. This is a massive topic. When I was pulling this presentation together, I realized this isn't a 40-minute talk. This is like about a 40-hour, 6-week lecture. And each part of it can be delved into an awful lot more depth. And there's all sorts of other nuances and genres and stuff like that, which we're not even really going to I wouldn't have time to look at it. So we're just kind of picking some of the major influences and getting through that. Just so you know. So I know what you're thinking already. Cathy McGowan was also part of this whole mod movement too, and she had a boutique, as did many. The whole boutique culture kind of came out of England and was been very popular and spread very quickly around the world. And it was a whole way of creating these small runs of clothes that were essentially fast fashion. They weren't well made. They were never intended to be quality. They were intended to be cute and fun and quick. And that's exactly what she was producing. And the other thing that was happening too was an awful lot of vintage was beginning to appear. And this is probably my big Mick Jagger story that relates to the exhibition Unzipped. So Mick Jagger was going to be appearing on Ready, Steady, Go in 1966, May 27th, 1966. And so he went to Lord Kitchener's Valet, which was a shop in Portobello Road, and he bought that Grenadier Guardsman's drummer's jacket. And this is just at the period of time where a lot of the English houses are being broken up and sold, and the contents going off to antique dealers, and Americans are coming over and buying huge quantities of antiques and sort of stuff. But nobody really wants the clothes. So the clothes are going into Portobello Road for resale, and the whole sort of mod generation kind of picks up on this. And you can see the picture on the right of a man and woman both wearing a guardsman jacket as well. So he wears one on the show on the 27th of May 1966. He sings "Paint It Black." And the next morning, apparently, I guess he was asked on the show where he got it, and he said, Lord Kitchener's Ballet. The next morning, apparently, there was 100 people lined up on the store, and everything was sold out of the shop by noon. So this was kind of a massive success, was this idea of wearing vintage clothing. And he wasn't the first person doing it. Barbra Streisand was wearing vintage clothing back in the early 60s when she was singing in East Village or West Village. So I mean, it was already a growing thing, but that sort of marks the beginning of when it really begins to take off and becomes this sort of really massively popular thing to do. And this is also a period in the 60s. You have to kind of remember that when I was apologizing for the various periods, the fact I'm not going to be talking about absolutely everything. This is when music just goes off in all sorts of different directions. So I mean, you've got psychedelic rock and surf rock and hard rock and reggae and soul and Motown and folk and all these kind of things happening all at the same time, and it's just really impossible to try and sort of follow what's happening everywhere. More boutiques are making a big impact. On the left is the Apple boutique that the Beatles ran into the ground for about a year. They had this lovely idea of creating beautiful clothes, and they hired this Dutch group of very creative people to do beautiful garments. I've seen some of them, and they are really well made. Not at a price point that would pay for the cost of creating them. So once the Apple boutique opened up, and it's on Baker Street, right near where Sherlock Holmes supposedly lived, it almost went broke immediately because they were just the cost was out of control for what they were actually getting for the garments in the boutique. And when it does actually come up for sale, occasionally in the market you'll find like a blouse or something come up for sale, and it goes for huge amounts of money. It's very collectible. On the right is actually the Pink Potbelly, which is an Ottawa boutique store, and there was all sorts of boutiques all over. This is how Marilyn Brooks began in Toronto, and my mind is not thinking of anyone else, but there's tons of boutiques all over the place that were producing these garments, these sort of small run garments for the young generation. So out of that comes the next wave, which is this whole sort of hippie wave. On the right, sorry, lost my track on my notes here. So on the right, we have the Monterey Pop Festival from June 1967. And this is where a lot of, you can see the fellow on the right there is wearing a beaded Indian jacket. There's this sort of mixture of ethnographic and vintage garments being pulled together. Jimi Hendrix is wearing various, I think probably a Turkish embroidered velvet vest. I'm not quite sure what the jacket is. So this sort of combination of different cultures, different periods, all kind of being thrown into one particular kind of melting pot of fashion and style. And then you also have the homemade part. And this is from Woodstock, a tie-dye booth at Woodstock Fair in August '69. The caricature on the right is actually from the Hippie Handbook, which was written in 1968, right after the Summer of Love in San Francisco. And it was a woman who basically wrote how to identify hippies, how they dressed, who they were. It was interesting because it was sort of insulting, but also kind of anthropological at the same time, that she was sort of pointing out, the telltale signs of hippies, what they were like and how they dressed and what they did and where they came from, that kind of thing. It's an interesting book to read through if you ever get a chance to do it. So she did these drawings also of how to identify your average typical hippie girl and average typical hippie boy. So like, no bra, carrying flowers, silver rings, peace buttons, that kind of stuff. All the sort of things you expect to find. So this whole hippie culture and the folk music that's associated with that, that's another huge relevance. And out of that comes a couple of things, just to let you know that every generation thinks that they invented sex. So here's some other things that have happened in the past that haven't been invented just recently. Certainly Black culture and the fashions that came out of it in the late 60s and early 70s are hugely important. They came pretty much out of the hippie movement. But you find that about 1968 is the crux, and that's of course when Martin Luther King is assassinated, and there's this whole sort of shift in Black culture in the United States. And you find now suddenly women are no longer ironing their hair; they're going for the afro. So they're going back to what is their natural hairstyles, that kind of thing, picking up on African textiles and dashikis and that sort of thing. So you have a lot of influence coming into fashion, which then infiltrates into high fashion into the 1970s. The other thing that you have a lot of influence happening at the same time is gender neutrality. So unisex, we used to call it then. And you have his and hers clothes, which are the same. This is a very modest example, but you can actually get examples which are really quite silly and amazing and over the top. And that leads us into the early 70s, where you also have the next stage of the influence of gay culture. And the New York Dolls in 1973, early punk, you could call them band glam punk kind of thing going on, wearing makeup, high platform shoes, all that kind of influence as well. So gender neutrality, gay influence, Black influence, these are all things that have been around for a while, and in various waves they come and go in their level of importance. On the right, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, of course, was also hugely influential. That's my sister dressed up as Magenta, I think is the character, right? Who's the one in the maid uniform. Anyway, so she went to an episode or a play, a version of it in 75 or 76, whenever it was, and dressed up for it. So all this kind of glam flamboyance, which happened in the early 70s through glam and also through funk in the United States and glam in Britain, makes a huge influence on fashion. And then that begins to lead into the punk movement, which is sort of the opposite of disco. These two things kind of happen at the same time. And often when people are doing histories, they'll put one before the other, and they're really happening exactly at the same time. They have their origins sort of 74, 5, 6. They're at their height, 77, 78, 79. And then they just kind of plummet in 80, 81. But they still exist, but just not the same feverish height that they had beforehand. So they're both really about the same time period. So you have the whole punk influence as well. The 70s look on the left, which is a little raw. It's a little about a little more torn up and found in thrift and that kind of thing. It's not quite as designed as the 80s punk is. The look on the right is definitely more put together. Just doing the hair in the morning takes hours. So there's a lot of work put into that particular look. The 70s, again, the vintage culture. This is Screaming Mimi's on the left-hand side, 1977, and Cyndi Lauper, 1985 on the right. It's not a hard to go from point A to point B. In fact, on the left, it looks very much like Madonna's first look was in her album as well. And that was 84, I think, that she did her first album. So it might have been 83. I think it was 84. So anyway, it's this look of using crinolines and Merry Widows and old high-heeled shoes and various jewelry from various bits, like putting these sort of vintage looks together, becomes a whole look for pop in the 80s. Disco, this is from Studio 54. It also adds to this whole kind of spectacle of dressing for occasion. I mean, this is the kind of thing you're now getting on the red carpet with these sensational gowns and stuff like that are now being created by top couturiers and important designers. They're a little more homemade in the 1970s, or definitely sort of small manufacture, nothing that's as large. So it begins here, this sort of spectacular kind of culture, drag culture kind of thing, even which enters into fashion from here. And then out of the glam of the 70s, you also get into the new wave and the Blitz kids, and again, this sort of amorphous kind of, this is where Boy George comes out of, this sort of amorphous kind of sexuality, look, gender neutrality, that kind of thing, certainly from the late 70s into the 80s. and even enters into metal and hair bands. So this is kind of a glam metal hair band look. And you get that with names are completely escaping from the moment. I can't think of anybody's name anymore as I've got it written down. Anyways, it's just, you know, another one to look in the 80s, which survives from the glam rock into the 80s as well. Then as sort of, while that's happening, you have rap beginning. And this is sort of the other end of the bookend. It's kind of the newest form of music. Everything else had been kind of morphing and shifting and playing off each other and growing kind of thing. Rap kind of comes out of its own origins. It doesn't sort of rely on anyone else quite so much. And the same thing with the fashion, which are very much urban everyday clothes. It's what Black kids are wearing on the street in the Bronx, that kind of thing. And that's primarily where it begins. So it's this combination of it's a street culture that's a combination of scratching records and rapping and sampling and breakdancing, that kind of thing. And with that are hoodies and sports jackets, Adidas shoes, Kangol hats, that kind of thing. So very much everyday type of fashions that you would expect to see being worn anywhere. Then there's kind of a division in the 80s where rap goes into, there's a West Coast style, which is more about street culture and gangs, and East Coast style, which is more about high living and champagne and gold and that kind of thing. So those sort of elements, right here, even a little bit of grunge influence happening and into their outfits as well. So you're going to get that sort of crossover happening as well. You also have the whole goth thing coming out of punk. And this is another thing too, where there's so many different names. You know, there's death punk and cyber goth and all these kind of things, and none of them are the same, but they're all kind of related. And if you have someone here who is a huge goth fan, everything I just said was wrong, because there's very specific names for all the very specific looks. There's a couple of really, I think, great videos that were done about the history of goth look. If you YouTube them, they were done by Toronto the stylist. I can't remember her name off the top of my head right now. But anyway, she's done these sort of history of male goth and female goth in the 80s and 90s, and I think they're quite wonderful anyway. So worthy of taking a look. And meanwhile, that's also happening. You still have mall culture, suburban, going to the mall, and it's sort of pop. It's kind of based on what pop stars, some of the pop stars were wearing, Kelly Marie and that kind of thing. And it's nice girl stuff. But it has nothing to do with all the other little subcultures are doing. It becomes so multi-layered, and fashion is doing this and music is doing this. There's too many looks all available at the same time. And you really sort of dress for the culture that you are most into. Grunge in the early 90s, of course, is kind of a throwback to hippies in a way, because it's all about kind of beat up clothes and homemade and handmade, but there's also got a bit of rap in there, and it's sort of again kind of a mishmash of different forms of influence as well. And then you also get this whole retro thing, and this is the big thing in fashion and in music. And in the 1990s, artists are transforming their images into brands, and their videos are being integrated into the music and fashion being integrated into videos. So you're beginning to create a look that goes with each of the artists, and that creates all sorts of new genres as well. And in the 90s, you have things like country and grunge being charted as high as rock and rap and boy band pop and that kind of thing. So it's all kind of happening at the same time. So you have these sort of retro looks, like this sort of 70s retro look here with this advertisement for boots from Browns. On the right, you have a bit of steampunk happening, a little bit of there's Lolita happening, there's a whole sort of Japanese thing, name which got from my head at the moment, which had never really quite took hold in the West. But it's definitely a look which had a beginning and middle and end, and it's kind of moved on already in Japan, but hugely popular at the time. Then you get into the 2000s, and again, there's this whole music is relying on mashups and cover versions and sampling, and fashion is doing the same thing too. It's sort of sampling and mashing up and covering historic styles and doing different kind of things. So you have sort of, high-rise sailor pants, and you've got crinoline from the 50s. You have a Merry Widow bustier, and cut off jeans, and a little bit of punk, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, all kind of thrown in together. There's a bit of Jimi Hendrix here with sort of embroidered scarf. There's a bit of everything going on, and a lot of these designers also have their own brands, so their own labels as well. So it's about sort of melding their style into a product. And I guess when you consider that the music is being tapped for free, so basically you kind of have to make the most of your name to sell, to make more money, and to also get and to do more work in concerts, that sort of thing. You can't just make a record and sit back anymore. You don't have to keep working in order to keep your fame working for you financially. There's been a few sort of things happening in more recent years, which are a bit strange. I think hip hop, got into this whole idea of these expensive, like the Louis Vuitton man bags. It was just sort of a brief kind of fad for a while. I think about 2007, that was sort of a big thing. A massive mistake was I forgot the name of the designer now, who did these sweatshirts with bullet holes in them, with the names of the high schools where they had the shootings. That was just done about 3 or 4 years ago, I think, maybe 5 years ago. So that wasn't a very successful idea, but they're trying to pick up on the idea of pop culture, of trends, of news items, that kind of thing, to keep products selling. The sneaker is probably the biggest thing that has come out of hip hop. On the top there is the classic Air Force One. That was originally launched in 1982 using the Air technology. It was hugely popular. It was sort of waning a little bit in popularity when what's his name? Do I have it written down here? Nelly did the song in 2002, Air Force Ones, and that sort of revived the popularity to the point where Nike actually reissued the shoe in 2007, and they're still available today. So there's some really minor change. You can tell the difference between the old ones and the new ones. I can't remember what it is now. But anyways, otherwise, basically the exact same shoe has now been available for 40 years, since 1982. And then that has inspired designers from Paris that used to do couture evening gowns to create sneakers. So fashion's now kind of going the opposite way. It used to be that Paris would create something, would trickle down and turn into street fashion. Now street fashion is working its way up the ladder and turning itself into high couture. And this is what you're seeing now too. When you go to a lot of the Grammys and the award shows, that sort of stuff, these incredible dresses are being worn by rock stars, people who used to be rebellious and wear jeans and throw fingers at the at the camera, that sort of stuff. They're now in the most glamorous, expensive designer garments, and they're either expensive because they're under their own label, they're selling them like Kanye West is actually cheap, or they're buying them from these designers, borrowing them from these designers sometimes too. And then there's sometimes you have to kind of draw the line. I don't want to end this negatively, but you have someone like Billie Eilish, who and she got a lot of flack for this, but I mean, this is not the character that she originally designed herself to be. I mean, she was this kind of badass girl with a great song, and then she kind of cleaned herself up and turned herself into a product for the cover of Vogue. So it certainly has been very controversial, and I guess the message is it's cosplay. It's all it is clothes. You dress up however you want. And one day you can be a tease in a pointy bra, and the next day you can be a bad girl in a grunge outfit. So I guess you don't take it all too seriously. It's more about just going with whatever look you want to go, and that's really what music is too now. It's so integrated and so overlapped, like fashion is. It's one day you do one thing, next day you do something else. So that's pretty much what I have for this teenage exploration, youth culture explanation of fashion and music. This is the exhibition that we have. It's on display right now in the gallery. We're highlighting some of the top looks. We have a teddy boy outfit, and there's a Beatles shirt with embroidery on it that someone has done as a love tribute to the Beatles. We have disco and cyber goth and all sorts of different looks in the exhibition. I think there's about 30 different looks. It's not a massively huge exhibition, but it's just to look at this concept of fashion and music and teenage culture. So there you go. Do I need to do something now?
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was fantastic. Definitely so many different types of clothes throughout the decades. It's impossible to go through them all, but that was a really fantastic overview. Quick question for you. What was your favorite decade of fashion?
Well, it happened when I was between 15 and 24. So I would have to say it was new wave. I just love new wave. I know how to use mousse in a hairdryer like nobody, and
Yeah,
or eyeliner, and yeah, I loved yeah, Depeche
fantastic.
Mode, that kind of stuff. Totally into it.
Yep,
I still listen to it too.
definitely. You see any new or old new trends coming up in today's fashion at all? Based
You know,
off
it's
of
funny, as a fashion historian, I honestly don't really pay attention to what is happening right now. And
oh,
right now, especially, is very confusing because of the pandemic. It's just, I
of
don't know
course.
what's going on. And the designers themselves are really trying to make a living, stay afloat, and also get the luxury brands going again, because that's the main engine behind the fashion industry, to get the luxury brands going. And some people are going over top and doing amazing things like Balenciaga and Schiaparelli, and some people are going safe and doing things which are really wearable like Chanel. And I don't know, it's interesting to see what happens. But a lot of designers, because of COVID, have just reissued. Like a lot of the spring 2020 collections were just reissued for the spring 2021. Because they had all this stock, you know, and they didn't know what to do with it. So it's been interesting. And the same thing happened during the Spanish influenza too. There's this little sort of burp in fashion. We're not quite sure what happened. Sort of 1920, it's all kind of confused. And the same thing is happening right now too. So we'll see if we get back on track. But there's been some interesting movement with textiles and things like that. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, individually, I'm not quite sure what's going on.
Yeah. Well, it will definitely be interesting over the next few years to see kind of how fashion comes out of this pandemic, especially since I think most people's fashion lately has been sweatpants and large t-shirts.
Oh yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, I hope everyone learned a little something. To keep up to date with us at the museum, you can go online at themuseum.ca as well if you're interested in purchasing tickets to our Unzipped exhibition. I've included links in the chat as well for anyone who would like more information. And yeah, thank you again, Jonathan. And I hope everyone has a really great rest of your evening. Thank you. Good night, everyone.